Catherine held a small white envelope in her hands. She had been writing and rewriting the same letter for 3 days. Every time she thought she had found the right words to express the nation's pain, she would start over again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the envelope. This was not just any ordinary royal duty. This was something that came from her heart. The tragedy had happened just 1 week ago. A terrible accident at a school in Manchester had taken the lives of 28 children and 6 teachers. The whole country had stopped everything to mourn. Television channels had canceled their regular programs. Radio stations played only sad music. Even the weather seemed to match the nation's mood, with gray clouds covering the sky for days. William remembered the phone call that had woken him up that morning. His private secretary had called with the terrible news. At first, William could not believe what he was hearing. He had asked the secretary to repeat the news 3 times. When the reality finally hit him, William had sat on the edge of his bed and put his head in his hands. Catherine had woken up and seen her husband's face. She knew immediately that something horrible had happened. The royal couple had spent the next few days reading every letter that arrived at Buckingham Palace. Thousands of people had written to them. Parents, grandparents, teachers, and children from all over the country had shared their feelings. Many of the letters were wet with tears. Some were written in shaky handwriting by elderly people. Others came from young children who drew pictures instead of writing words. One letter had particularly touched Catherine's heart. It was from a mother named Sarah who lived in Manchester. She had lost her 7-year-old daughter Emma in the tragedy. Sarah had written about how Emma loved to dance and how she always sang while getting ready for school. The letter described how Emma had been excited about a school play that was supposed to happen the following week. Sarah had ended her letter by saying that she did not know how to live in a world without her daughter's laughter. Reading that letter had changed something in Catherine. She had immediately asked William if they could do something more than just send flowers and make official statements. She wanted to meet with the families personally. She wanted to look into their eyes and tell them that their pain mattered. William had agreed without hesitation. He had learned from his own mother, Princess Diana, that sometimes the most important royal duty was simply to be present with people who were suffering. The palace staff had initially been nervous about the idea. They were worried about security and protocol. They suggested that the royal couple could make a formal visit to Manchester and lay a wreath at the school. But William and Catherine had insisted on something different. They wanted to invite the families to London. Wanted to create a space where people could grieve together without cameras or reporters watching their every move. Planning the memorial service had taken careful thought. Catherine had personally chosen Westminster Abbey because she felt that the ancient building could hold the weight of so much sorrow. She had walked through the Abbey 3 times, imagining where each family would sit and how the service would flow. She had asked the Archbishop to keep his words simple and short. This was not a time for long speeches or complicated ceremonies. William had taken charge of the guest list. Instead of inviting government officials and dignitaries, he had personally called each family that had been affected by the tragedy. His conversations with the parents had often lasted for hours. Many of them had cried on the phone while talking. To him, some had shared memories of their children. Others had simply sat in silence, while William listened patiently. The morning of the memorial service had arrived gray and cold. As their car approached Westminster Abbey, Catherine could see that hundreds of people had gathered outside despite the early hour. They stood quietly holding flowers and small photographs. Many wore black clothes and some held hands with strangers. The sight made Catherine's heart feel both heavy and grateful at the same time. William reached over and took his wife's hand. As their car stopped in front of the Abbey, neither of them said anything, but both understood that this day would change them forever. They were about to step into a room filled with the deepest kind of human pain. They were about to look into the eyes of parents who had lost their children and teachers who had lost their colleagues. As they stepped out of the car, the morning air felt sharp against their faces. The crowd outside the Abbey fell completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Catherine clutched her white envelope tighter, and William straightened his black tie. They walked toward the ancient doors of Westminster Abbey, knowing that on the other side waited families whose lives had been torn apart by tragedy. The heavy wooden doors opened slowly, and the royal couple stepped inside. The abbey was filled with soft candlelight and the quiet sound of people breathing. Hundreds of faces turned toward them. These were not the usual faces they saw at royal events. These were faces marked by grief and loss. These were the faces of real people living through the worst moments of their lives. Catherine felt her heart beating faster as she and William began to walk down the long aisle toward the altar. Every step brought them closer to the families who were waiting for them. Every step brought them deeper into a moment that would touch the hearts of millions of people around the world. Catherine looked out at the first row where Sarah Mitchell sat holding a small photograph of her daughter, Emma. Sarah's eyes were red from crying, but she managed to give Catherine a small nod. Next to Sarah sat David and Linda Thompson, who had lost their twin boys in the tragedy. David held Linda's hand tightly while she pressed a tissue to her eyes. In the same row was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly teacher who had worked at the Manchester school for 30 years. She had lost 6 of her students and 2 fellow teachers in the accident. William stepped forward and began to speak without using any written notes. His voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. He talked about how he and Catherine had read every single letter that people had sent to the palace. He mentioned specific details from some of the letters which surprised many of the families. They had not expected the royal couple to actually read their personal words. William spoke about Emma's love for dancing and the twins' shared dream of becoming firefighters. He remembered Mrs. Rodriguez's letter about how her students always made her laugh during lunchtime. As William continued speaking, something unusual began to happen in the abbey. People started to cry openly without trying to hide their tears. In most royal events, everyone tried to behave perfectly and show no emotion. But this morning was different. This was a place where grief was welcome and tears were understood. Catherine felt her own eyes filling with water as she watched a young father in the third row break down completely while holding a small teddy bear. Catherine then opened her white envelope and pulled out the letter she had written. Her hand shook slightly as she unfolded the paper. She had practiced reading this letter many times, but now her voice felt stuck in her throat. She looked up at all the faces watching her and took a deep breath. When she finally spoke, her words came from somewhere deep inside her heart, rather than from the paper in her hands. She talked about being a mother herself, and how the tragedy had made her hold her own children tighter every night. She spoke about the phone calls she had made to Manchester families, and how their strength had amazed her. Catherine mentioned that she had learned the names of every child and teacher who had died. She had looked at their photographs and read about their dreams and hobbies. To her, they were not just numbers in a news report. They were real people, with real families who loved them. In the middle of Catherine's speech, a small girl in the 4th row stood up. She was about 8 years old, with curly brown hair and wearing a black dress that was too big for her. This was Lucy Chen, whose older sister had died in the tragedy. Lucy walked slowly toward Catherine, carrying something in her small hands. The security guards started to move, but William held up his hand to stop them. Lucy reached Catherine and held up a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing she had made with crayons. The picture showed 2 girls playing together in a garden full of flowers. One girl had wings like an angel. Lucy pointed to the girl with wings and whispered that this was her sister watching over her from heaven. Catherine knelt down to Lucy's level and looked carefully at the drawing. Tears ran down Catherine's face as she thanked Lucy for sharing something so precious. William came over and gently asked Lucy if she would like to tell everyone about her sister. Lucy nodded, and William lifted her up so she could speak into the microphone. In her small, clear voice, Lucy told the whole abbey about how her sister used to read bedtime stories to her every night. She said her sister promised to always protect her, even from heaven. When Lucy finished speaking, there was not a dry eye anywhere in the building. After Lucy returned to her seat, Catherine stood up and made an announcement that surprised everyone. She said that she and William wanted to meet personally with every family in the abbey, not quickly like at most royal events, but properly with time to listen to their stories. She explained that they had cleared their schedules for the entire day because nothing was more important than being present with people who were grieving. The royal couple then did something that had never happened before in Westminster Abbey. They left the altar and walked into the pews to sit with the families. William sat down next to an elderly man who had lost his granddaughter. Catherine joined a group of mothers who had all lost children in the same classroom. The formal structure of a royal event completely disappeared as real conversations began to happen throughout the abbey. For the next 3 hours, William and Catherine moved slowly through every row of seats. They listened to stories about children who loved soccer and daughters who wanted to become doctors. They heard about teachers who stayed late to help struggling students and custodians who knew every child's name. Each story added another layer to their understanding of just how much had been lost in Manchester. Mrs. Rodriguez told Catherine about a student named Miguel who always brought her flowers from his grandmother's garden. Misa Mitchell shared memories of Emma's terrible, a singing voice that somehow made everyone smile. The Thompson parents talked about how their twins used to finish each other's sentences and dream the same dreams at night. With each story, William and Catherine felt the weight of the community that had been shattered by tragedy. As the afternoon, sunlight began to filter through the abbey's ancient windows, Catherine realized that something important was happening. These families were not just sharing their grief with the royal couple. They were sharing their grief with each other. Parents who had never met before were holding hands and comforting one another. Teachers were embracing the parents of their former students. Community was slowly beginning to heal together in the sacred space of Westminster Abbey. Catherine showed the message to William, who read it quickly. They both looked around the abbey at all the families who were still sharing stories and comforting each other. These people needed them here, but apparently the whole country was now responding to what was happening. William made a decision that would surprise his security team and palace staff. He stood up and announced to everyone in the abbey that he and Catherine wanted to go to Buckingham Palace together with all the families. The idea seemed impossible at first. Palace protocol had never allowed for hundreds of grieving families to simply walk into the royal residence, but William was determined to make it happen. He called his private secretary and told him to open the palace gates for everyone who wanted to come. He said that today was not about following rules, but about being with people who needed support. The walk from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace normally took about 15 minutes. But this walk was different from any royal procession that had ever happened before. William and Catherine walked in the middle of the crowd instead of being separated by security barriers. They held hands with children and put their arms around crying parents. The streets of London had never seen anything like this before. As they walked, more and more people joined them. Office workers left their buildings to walk alongside the families. Shopkeepers closed their stores and stepped onto the sidewalks. Bus drivers stopped their buses and passengers got out to join the growing crowd. By the time they reached the palace, nearly 10,000 people were walking together through the heart of London. The scene at Buckingham Palace was unlike anything in British royal history. The famous black gates were wide open and people were flowing onto the palace grounds. Palace guards stood at attention, but there was no need for crowd control. Everyone moved slowly and respectfully. Many people carried single flowers or small photographs. Others held homemade signs with messages of love and remembrance. Catherine noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on a bench near the palace entrance. The woman was holding a small white rose, and tears were streaming down her face. Catherine walked over and sat down beside her. The woman introduced herself as Margaret and explained that she had lost her great-granddaughter in the Manchester tragedy. Margaret had traveled from Scotland by train to be here today, even though she was 87 years old and had never been to London before. William saw his wife talking with Margaret and came over to join them. Margaret told them that her great-granddaughter Jenny had been the light of her life. Jenny used to call her every Sunday and always ended their conversations by saying she loved her great-grandma more than all the stars in the sky. Margaret said she did not know how she would live without those Sunday phone calls. As Margaret shared her story, other people began to gather around the bench. Soon, there was a circle of about 50 people, all listening to Margaret talk about Jenny. When she finished, a man named Robert shared a story about his nephew who had died in the tragedy. Then a woman named Patricia talked about her daughter's teacher who had been killed trying to protect her students. This pattern continued for hours across the palace grounds. Small groups of people formed naturally, and stories were shared. William and Catherine moved from group to group, listening and offering comfort. They sat on the grass with families. They looked at photographs of children and teachers who had died. They heard about dreams that would never be fulfilled and plans that would never happen. As evening approached, Catherine realized that something extraordinary was happening. The palace grounds had become a place of healing. Strangers were hugging each other. People were sharing food and water. Children who had lost siblings were playing together while their parents watched and sometimes smiled through their tears. The formal barriers between the royal family and the people had completely disappeared. William found himself sitting in a circle with about 20 teenagers who had lost friends in the Manchester tragedy. These young people told him about their classmates who had died. They talked about inside jokes that no one else would understand, and shared memories of school trips and birthday parties. One boy named James said that his best friend had been planning to ask a girl to the school dance. Now James felt guilty every time he laughed or had fun because his friend would never get to experience those things. Catherine was with a group of mothers who were all dealing with similar feelings of guilt and anger. Some of them were angry at God for letting this happen. Others were angry at themselves for not being able to protect their children. One mother named Helen said she kept replaying the morning of the tragedy in her mind, wondering if she could have done something different to keep her son home from school that day. As the sun began to set, palace staff brought out tables of food and hot tea for everyone. The Queen's private chef had prepared sandwiches and soup for the thousands of people gathered on the palace grounds. This had never happened before in the history of the British monarchy. The royal residence had become a refuge for grieving people from all walks of life. William and Catherine made another unprecedented decision. They announced that the palace would stay open all night for anyone who needed a place to grieve or find comfort. Palace staff quickly set up tents and brought out blankets. Some families decided to stay, while others slowly began to make their way home. But everyone understood that something historic had happened at Buckingham Palace that day. As darkness fell over London, Catherine looked out at the hundreds of people still gathered on the palace grounds. Small groups continued to share stories by candlelight. Children slept in their parents' arms while adults talked quietly about their losses. The formal gates of Buckingham Palace had been opened not just physically but emotionally, creating a space where the royal family and the people could grieve together as one community. William was already awake and had been walking through the palace grounds since sunrise. He found families who had stayed overnight and was bringing them hot coffee and fresh pastries from the palace kitchen, the site of the future King of England. Serving breakfast to grieving families would have shocked royal observers. But William felt more comfortable in this role than he had ever felt during formal state functions. By mid-morning, news cameras had arrived outside the palace gates. Television reporters from around the world wanted to cover the story of what was being called the most unusual royal event in modern history. But Catherine made a decision that surprised the media. She asked the reporters to stay outside the gates and give the families privacy to grieve. She said that this was not a performance or publicity event, but a real moment of human connection. Inside the palace grounds, something beautiful was continuing to happen. The families who had lost loved ones in Manchester were now forming deep friendships with each other. Sarah Mitchell, who had lost her daughter Emma, was sitting with the Thompson family, who had lost their twin boys. They were no longer strangers, brought together by tragedy. They were becoming a support system for each other. Catherine joined Sarah and the Thompsons on a blanket spread under one of the palace's ancient oak trees. Sarah was showing photographs of Emma to Linda Thompson, while David Thompson was reading a letter that one of the twins had written to him for Father's Day. The letter said that when the boy grew up, he wanted to be just like his dad and help people who were in trouble. A young teacher named Miss Williams, who had survived the Manchester tragedy, was also sitting with the group. She had been in the school that day but was in a meeting when the accident happened. Miss Williams told them that she felt guilty for surviving when so many of her colleagues and students had died. She said she woke up every night thinking about the children she would never see again and the lessons she would never get to teach them. William sat down with the group and listened to Miss Williams talk about her feelings of guilt. He shared something very personal with her. He told her about losing his own mother, Princess Diana, and how for years He had felt angry and guilty about things he could not control. William said that grief was not something you got over, but something you learned to carry with you while still finding ways to help other people. As they talked, more people joined their circle under the oak tree. An elderly man named Mr. Peterson, who had lost his grandson, shared stories about teaching the boy to fish. A young mother named Lisa talked about her daughter, who had loved to paint pictures of flowers. Mrs. Chen, whose daughter Lucy had shown her drawing to Catherine the day before, brought Lucy over to join the group. Lucy was carrying a new drawing she had made that morning. This picture showed all the people sitting together at Buckingham Palace, with the palace in the background. In the sky above the palace, she had drawn all the people who had died, watching over the gathering like guardian angels. Catherine looked at the drawing and felt tears in her eyes again. Lucy's ability to find hope and beauty even in the middle of tragedy amazed her. Throughout the day, the circle under the oak tree grew larger and larger. Palace staff brought chairs for the elderly people and toys for the children. The Queen's personal cook prepared lunch for everyone. What had started as a small conversation had become a community gathering that included nearly everyone who was still at the palace. Catherine noticed that the children who had lost siblings or friends were playing together while the adults talked. They had formed their own support group and were helping each other in ways that adults sometimes could not. She watched Lucy teaching other children how to draw pictures of their loved ones in heaven. A boy named Tommy was showing younger children how to make paper airplanes, something his brother who had died had taught him. As afternoon came, Catherine made an announcement that surprised everyone. She said that she and William wanted to visit Manchester to see the school where the tragedy had happened and to meet with more families in their own community. But she also said something else that was completely unexpected. She invited everyone who was at the palace to travel with them to Manchester if they wanted to. The idea of a royal visit to Manchester accompanied by hundreds of grieving families was unprecedented. Palace officials were worried about logistics and security, but William supported Catherine's invitation completely. He said that the families had become part of their extended family, and they wanted to grieve and heal together as one community. Plans were quickly made for a convoy of buses to take everyone who wanted to go to Manchester. The royal couple would travel with the families. Instead of in their usual separate car, palace security worked frantically to arrange protection for such an unusual traveling group. Hotel rooms were booked for families who lived far from Manchester and wanted to stay overnight. As evening approached, nearly 200 people had decided to make the journey to Manchester with William and Catherine. Families helped each other pack their few belongings. Children who had become friends over the past 2 days promised to sit together on the bus. Adults exchanged phone numbers and made plans to stay in touch after the trip. The buses arrived at Buckingham Palace just as the sun was setting. William and Catherine stood at the palace gates, thanking each family for sharing their stories and their grief. Many people hugged them goodbye, something that would have been impossible at a normal royal event. As the buses loaded up with families, palace staff, and security officers, Catherine felt that they were not just traveling to be Manchester, but carrying the healing spirit they had created at the palace to a community that needed it desperately. The convoy of buses pulled away from Buckingham Palace as darkness fell over London. Inside the buses, families continued to share stories and comfort each other. William and Catherine sat with different families on different buses during the journey, continuing the conversations that had started in Westminster Abbey and grown deeper at the palace. They were no longer just the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge completing a royal duty. They had become part of a community united by loss and committed to helping each other heal. As the buses pulled into Manchester, Catherine could see that thousands of people were already waiting for them. Word had spread through the city that the royal couple was coming with the families from London. But this was not like other royal visits where people came to wave flags and take photographs. The crowds in Manchester were quiet and respectful. Many held flowers or signs with messages of love and support. The first stop was the school where the tragedy had happened. William and Catherine had asked to visit the site privately with just the families who had been directly affected. The school building stood empty and quiet, with memorial flowers covering the front entrance. Police barriers kept the area secure, but the atmosphere was peaceful rather than tense. Catherine walked slowly toward the school entrance, holding hands with Sarah Mitchell and Mrs. Chen. Behind them walked William with the Thompson family and several other parents. The sight of the school building brought fresh tears to many eyes. This was where their children had spent their last happy moments. This was where teachers had tried desperately to protect their students. Miss Williams, the teacher who had survived, led them to the playground where many of the children used to play during recess. She pointed to a climbing frame where Emma Mitchell had loved to play pretend games with her friends. She showed them the soccer field where the Thompson twins had practiced with their school team. Every corner of the school grounds held memories of the people who had been lost. Lucy Chen walked up to the school building and placed her latest drawing against the wall next to hundreds of other flowers and tributes. Her drawing showed all the children and teachers who had died playing together in a beautiful garden. At the bottom of the picture, she had written in her careful child handwriting that she would never forget her. Friends and teachers. William knelt down next to Lucy and asked her to tell him about each person in her drawing. Lucy pointed to different figures and shared memories about her classmates and teachers. She talked about Mr. Johnson, who always made math fun by turning lessons into games. She remembered Maria, who shared her lunch every day with anyone who forgot to bring food. She described how Mrs. Anderson always had Band-Aids ready when children got hurt on the playground. As Lucy talked, other children joined them and began sharing their own memories. Soon there was a circle of about 20 children sitting on the ground near the school entrance, telling stories about their friends and teachers who had died. The adults stood nearby listening and sometimes crying as they heard their children's names mentioned with such love and warmth. Catherine realized that these children needed to remember their lost friends and teachers in their own way. She asked the school principal, who had joined them at the site, if there was a way to create a permanent memorial garden where children could come to remember and play. The principal said that the city had been discussing different memorial ideas but had not yet decided on anything specific. William immediately offered to help fund and organize a memorial garden that would be designed by the children themselves. He said that any memorial should reflect what the children wanted, rather than what adults thought was appropriate. The idea excited all the children, who began talking about what they would like to include in a special garden for their friends. After spending the morning at the school, the group traveled to Manchester Cathedral for a community service. Unlike the private memorial at Westminster Abbey, this service was open to anyone in Manchester who wanted to attend. The cathedral was completely filled, and hundreds more people stood outside listening through speakers that had been set up. The service was different from traditional church services. Instead of formal prayers and hymns, people were invited to share memories and stories. A parade of Manchester residents came forward to talk about the children and teachers who had died. Some shared funny stories that made everyone laugh through their tears. Others read poems or sang songs that had special meaning. One of the most powerful moments came when the entire school choir from a neighboring school performed a song that the children who had died had been practicing for their spring concert. The young voices filled the cathedral with a beautiful melody that their lost friends would never get to perform. By the end of the song, there was hardly a dry eye in the building. Catherine was asked to speak to the congregation, but instead she invited some of the families from London to share what they had learned over the past few days. Sarah Mitchell talked about how meeting other grieving families had helped her feel less alone in her pain. David Thompson said that sharing stories about his sons had helped him remember the joy they had brought to his life rather than focusing only on the sadness of losing them. After the cathedral service, something unexpected happened. The people of Manchester did not want the healing experience to end. They invited everyone to a community center where local restaurants had donated food for a large meal together. What started as a formal royal visit had become a community celebration of life and memory. At the community center, long tables were set up, and families from London sat mixed in with Manchester residents. Children played together while adults continued sharing stories and making new friendships. William and Catherine moved through the room talking with local families who had not lost anyone in the tragedy but wanted to show their support for those who had. As the day progressed, Catherine noticed that something remarkable was happening. The Manchester community was not just offering sympathy to the grieving families. They were learning from the example of healing and connection that had started in London. Local people were opening their hearts and homes to families who had lost loved ones. New support networks were forming that would continue long after the royal visit ended. By evening, plans had been made for ongoing connections between the London families and the Manchester community. Phone numbers were exchanged and social media groups were created. The healing circle that had started with William and Catherine at Westminster Abbey had grown to include hundreds of people, committed to supporting each other through grief and beyond. Catherine stood in the garden on a sunny morning in September, watching Lucy Chen and other children play on the rainbow-colored climbing frame they had designed to honor their lost friends. Each piece of playground equipment had been chosen to represent a different child or teacher who had died. Emma Mitchell's favorite swings were painted bright pink because that had been her favorite color. The Thompson twins were remembered with a seesaw because they had always done everything together. The garden had become much more than a memorial. It was a place where the community came together regularly. Every Sunday morning, families gathered here for picnics and informal support group meetings. Children played while parents talked about their ongoing journey through grief. The healing circle that had started at Westminster Abbey had taken root in Manchester and was growing stronger every week. William arrived at the garden carrying a large box filled with letters. Over the past 6 months, thousands of people from around the world had written to share how the royal couple's response to the Manchester tragedy had affected them. Teachers in Australia had created their own memorial gardens for students they had lost. Parents in Canada had started support groups inspired by the connections they had seen between the Manchester families. Sarah Mitchell approached William and Catherine with tears of gratitude in her eyes. She told them that the memorial garden had saved her life. In the months immediately after losing Emma, Sarah had not wanted to get out of bed or continue living. But the community connections formed during that week in London had given her a reason to keep going. She now helped coordinate the Sunday gatherings and had become a source of strength for other grieving parents. The Thompson family was also at the garden that morning. David and Linda had brought their photo albums to share with newer families who were just beginning their grief journey. They had learned that talking about their twins and sharing happy memories helped them feel connected to their sons rather than focusing only on the loss. The support network had taught them that grief was not something to hide, but something to share with people who understood. Miss Williams, the teacher who had survived, was now working as the garden coordinator. She had taken a leave from classroom teaching because being in schools was still too difficult for her. But working in the memorial garden allowed her to honor her lost colleagues while helping the community heal. She organized art projects where children could create tributes to people they missed, and reading circles where families shared favorite books of lost loved ones. Catherine walked through the garden and stopped at a special tree that had been planted in honor of all the teachers who had died. Hanging from the branches were small wooden plaques with favorite quotes and sayings. From each teacher, Mrs. Anderson's plaque read, "Every child is special and deserves to shine." Mr. Johnson's plaque said learning should always be fun and full of laughter. These simple words continued to inspire the children who visited the garden. As the morning progressed, more families arrived at the garden. Some were Manchester families who had been directly affected by the tragedy. Others were people from the surrounding areas who had heard about the community gatherings and wanted to offer support. The garden had become a symbol of how tragedy could bring people together rather than tear them apart. William sat down on a bench with Mr. Peterson, the elderly man who had lost his grandson. Mr. Peterson told William that he had started a fishing club for children who had lost family members. Every Saturday, he took groups of kids to a nearby lake, where he taught them to fish while they talked about their feelings. He said that his grandson would have loved knowing that his death had led to something that helped other children. Lucy Chen came running up to Catherine with another drawing. This picture showed the memorial garden filled with people of all ages playing and talking together. But this time, instead of drawing the lost loved ones as angels in the sky, Lucy had drawn them as part of the garden itself. She explained that she now felt like her sister and friends were always present in the garden, not watching from far away, but living in the flowers and trees and playground equipment that honored them. As the day continued, Catherine reflected on how much had changed since that first morning at Westminster Abbey, the formal barriers between the royal family and ordinary. People had never completely returned to what they were before. William and Catherine now regularly visited communities dealing with tragedy and loss, not as distant royal figures, but as people who understood that the most important response to grief was simply to be present with those who were suffering. The Manchester Memorial Garden had inspired similar projects in communities across Britain and around the world. But more importantly, it had shown that healing from tragedy was not something that happened to individuals in isolation. Real healing happened when communities came together to share their pain and support each other. Through the difficult process of learning to live with loss, as evening approached and families began to leave the garden, Catherine and William stayed behind to have a quiet moment together. They sat on the bench under Emma's swings and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink that Emma would have loved. The garden was peaceful but not empty. The laughter of children and the conversations of caring adults had filled this place with life and hope. William took Catherine's hand as they prepared to leave the garden. 6 months ago, they had faced one of the most heartbreaking situations imaginable. But by choosing to break protocol and open their hearts completely to grieving families, they had helped create something beautiful and lasting. The memorial garden would continue to be a place of healing for years to come, reminding everyone who visited that love is stronger than loss and community is more powerful than tragedy. As their car pulled away from the memorial garden, Catherine looked back one more time at the colorful playground equipment and flowering trees. Tomorrow, there would be more families gathering here to support each other. Children would play while parents shared stories and offered comfort. The healing circle that began with 2 people choosing compassion over protocol had become a permanent source of hope for a community that would never forget but had learned how to carry their grief together with love.